There is a street in Missouri that once heard 1,000 voices, and today you can stand in the middle of it and hear nothing but wind moving through empty windows. The sidewalks are still there. The brick storefronts are still standing. But the people who filled them, the steamboats that built them, and the river that gave them life, all of it is gone, or moved, or simply forgot to come back. Somewhere along the Missouri River, an entire chapter of American history was quietly erased, not by war, not by fire alone, but by something far stranger, a river that changed its mind. Tonight, we are going looking for what it left behind. The Missouri River does not behave like other rivers. Early travelers called it too thick to drink and too thin to plow, a river the color of chocolate milk, choked with silt, driftwood, and sunken trees called snags that could tear the bottom out of a boat in seconds. It begins in the mountains of Montana and travels more than 2,000 miles before it joins the Mississippi just north of St. Louis, and for 100 years it was the highway of the American frontier. Before the railroads, before the interstate highways, this river was how you got west. Every town that grew up along its banks in the 19th century believed, with total confidence, that the river would keep them alive forever. Almost none of them were right. To understand why, you have to understand what this river actually is. It shifts. It always has. The Missouri carves new channels, abandons old ones, and eats away at its own banks with a violence that early settlers underestimated at their own peril. A town built 100 yards from the water in one decade could find itself either flooded or, just as strangely, stranded a mile from the water in the next. And when the steamboats that made these towns rich were replaced by railroads that had no reason to follow the river's curves, an entire network of thriving ports was left behind, still facing a water highway that no longer carried any traffic at all. This is the story of what happened to them. We begin in Howard County, at a place that no longer technically exists. In 1816, a small settlement was staked out on the north bank of the Missouri River and named for Benjamin Franklin. Within a few years, Franklin was not just a town, it was the western edge of the entire United States. It became the county seat in 1817. It got a U.S. land office in 1818. In 1819, the first newspaper ever printed west of the Mississippi River rolled off a press here. And in 1821, a trader named William Becknell set out from Franklin streets toward Santa Fe, opening a trade route that would become one of the most famous roads in American history. At its peak, Franklin held somewhere between 1,500 and 1,700 residents, a staggering number for the frontier at that time. This was the boyhood home of a young man who would grow up to become one of the most legendary scouts of the American West, Kit Carson. 4 future governors walked these streets. 2 future Supreme Court justices grew up here. Missouri's first United States Senator called this town home. And then, over the course of just 2 years, the river simply took it back. In 1826, and again in 1828, unusual flooding hit the Missouri River, and Franklin discovered a fatal flaw in its own foundation. The town had been built on sandy, unstable ground right along the riverbank, and as the floodwaters rose, that sand began to collapse into the current. House after house slid into the water. Streets crumbled at the edges. Residents watched buildings they had lived in for years disappear into the brown current of the river that had made the town rich in the first place. There was no fighting it. Franklin's residents packed up what they could carry and relocated to higher ground a short distance away, founding a new town they called, appropriately, New Franklin. The old site, what people now call Old Franklin, was left to the river. For a while, a few foundations remained, scattered reminders of where a booming frontier capital used to stand. But by the early 20th century, even those were nearly gone. And then, in the historic flood of 1993, one of the most devastating floods in Missouri River history, the last visible traces of Old Franklin disappeared for good, along with a marker that had stood for decades commemorating the start of the Santa Fe Trail. Today, if you drive along Missouri Highway 87 near Boonville, you are passing directly over what was once one of the most important towns in the American West, and there is nothing there to tell you so. The town that helped launch the Santa Fe Trail is now, quite literally, underwater and underground, swallowed by the very river that built it. But Franklin's story raises a question that becomes the heartbeat of this entire journey. If a town this important could vanish so completely, how many others did the river erase without anyone writing it down? The answer, it turns out, is more than you would ever guess. And the next stop on this river is a place that didn't disappear completely, it did something almost more haunting. It survived, frozen, as the world around it moved on without it. Follow the Missouri River east from Old Franklin, up onto a limestone bluff overlooking the water, and you'll find a village called Arrow Rock. Its name comes from a French phrase, pierre à flèche, meaning rock of arrows, recorded on a map as early as 1732, long before any American settlement existed here. By the 1860s, Arrow Rock was one of the busiest river ports between St. Louis and Kansas City. Its population had climbed to roughly 1,000 people. 14 stores lined its streets. There were warehouses, a woolen factory, flour mills, sawmills, 2 schools, 4 churches, a solvent bank, and even an art gallery. Steamboats loaded with hemp and other cargo departed constantly from its wharves. A local doctor named John Sappington had developed and manufactured quinine-based fever pills here, an enterprise that generated real wealth and shipped his medicine across the frontier. One of Missouri's most celebrated painters, George Caleb Bingham, called this town home. 3 future governors of Missouri came from this one small river port. Then came the Civil War, and Arrow Rock's fortunes began a slide from which they would never fully recover. The town's prosperity, like so much of what was known as Missouri's Little Dixie, had been built in part on enslaved labor, and roughly a third of the surrounding county's population had been enslaved people before the war. When the fighting reached the river, federal gunboats shelled the town, and residents fled beyond the city limits. Steamboats continued to be targeted along the water for years afterward. And even after the war ended, even after emancipation brought new residents to Arrow Rock hoping to rebuild, the town could never quite recapture what it had lost. In 1872, a catastrophic fire tore through the business district, destroying 2- and 3-story buildings in what one local newspaper called the most destructive fire the town had ever known. But fire and war were only the beginning of Arrow Rock's undoing. The deeper wound came from something the town could never fight back against: it lost the railroad. As rail lines expanded across Missouri in the decades after the war, Arrow Rock tried repeatedly to attract a route through town. Every attempt failed. The railroads instead served growing hubs like Sedalia and Kansas City, bypassing Arrow Rock entirely, and without rail access, the town had no way to compete as steamboat commerce faded into history. Its population, which had peaked near 1,000, fell to 400 by 1910. And then, in 1929, the river itself delivered what felt like a final verdict. A major flood shifted the Missouri River's channel roughly a mile away from the town it had built. The steamboat landing where travelers once ferried across the water, where boats once docked and unloaded, was simply left behind on dry land. Arrow Rock was no longer even a river town. The river had moved on without asking. Today, Arrow Rock's population sits at around 57 people. And yet, walk its streets, and you find something almost nowhere else in America, a town so thoroughly bypassed by progress that it was essentially preserved by accident. Arrow Rock is now a National Historic Landmark, its original street grid unchanged since it was surveyed in the 1810s, its historic stone gutters still running along the roads, its wooden sidewalks still fronting brick storefronts from the steamboat era. It is, in a strange way, a town that survived by failing. Because nothing new was ever built to replace what came before is still standing. Not every river town got that mercy. Continue along the Missouri toward Boone County, and you reach Rocheport, a town whose name comes from the French for Rocheport, a reference to the limestone bluffs that rise dramatically along this stretch of river. Rocheport became known for something beyond ordinary cargo traffic. It sat near a set of caves that steamboat companies eventually turned into a tourist attraction, advertising grand excursions for passengers by the 1890s. But long before Rocheport became a pleasure stop, it was a working river town, and working river towns paid a price that rarely gets mentioned in the history books. The river itself killed people, constantly, without warning. In 1836, a sidewheel steamboat called the Diana struck a submerged snag in the river near Rocheport and sank, at a bend of the river still known today as Diana Bend. In 1880 and 1881, a steam ferry called the Little Dick carried passengers back and forth across the water, until it, too, sank. These weren't unusual events. They were simply how the river operated. Steamboating on the Missouri lasted from 1819 all the way through the 1920s, and across that entire century, hundreds of steamboats went down somewhere along this river's length, torn open by hidden trees, ripped apart by their own boilers, or simply overwhelmed by a current that never stopped shifting beneath them. Most of those wrecks were never recovered. Some of them are still down there today, buried under decades of shifting silt, their cargo and their stories sealed beneath the mud of a river that keeps its secrets. One of those disasters happened not far from here, at the town of Lexington, and it remains, to this day, one of the deadliest events in the entire history of Missouri River steamboating. In April of 1852, the steamboat Saluda approached a particularly difficult bend in the river near Lexington, fighting hard against the current. Frustrated by the boat's lack of progress, its captain made the fatal decision to increase the pressure in the boat's boilers to force it through. The boilers could not take the strain. The Saluda's boilers exploded with a force that devastated the boat and killed a large portion of the passengers and crew on board, many of them Mormon emigrants traveling west. It remains one of the worst disasters in the river's long and violent history, a reminder that the romance of the steamboat era came with a body count that modern audiences rarely hear about. Further downriver sits a town with one of the more unusual naming stories on the entire Missouri, Napoleon. Laid out in 1836 and almost certainly named after Napoleon Bonaparte, the town sits just a few miles from another small community called Wellington, named, in a wink to European history, after the commander who defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Waterloo. And true to the joke, roughly halfway between the two towns sits a tiny crossroads that residents named, of course, Waterloo. It's a small piece of frontier humor buried in a landscape otherwise defined by hardship, and it tells you something about the people who settled this stretch of river, even as steamboats sank around them, even as towns collapsed and rebuilt on higher ground again and again, they still found room for a joke about the emperor who lost. Napoleon itself was no stranger to the river's violence. In 1868, a steamboat called the Princess struck a snag directly at Napoleon and went down, just one more entry in the long list of vessels the Missouri River claimed. Napoleon still exists today, a quiet town of a couple hundred people, a fraction of what these river communities imagined for themselves in the boom years of the 19th century. By now, a pattern should be emerging, and it is worth stopping to name it directly, because it is the real villain of this story. It was not any single flood, or any single fire, or any single wreck that erased these towns from American memory. It was a slow, compounding collision between three forces: a river that physically would not sit still, a railroad industry that had no reason to follow the river's winding path, and, later, a 20th-century engineering project that changed the Missouri River more permanently than any flood ever had. Starting in the early 1900s and accelerating for decades afterward, the Army Corps of Engineers undertook a massive effort to tame the Missouri River, narrowing it, straightening it, and stabilizing its banks to make it more predictable for modern barge traffic and to protect farmland from the kind of catastrophic flooding that had destroyed towns like Old Franklin a century earlier. It worked, in the sense that the river became more controllable. But it also permanently rerouted the water away from towns that had been built specifically because the river once ran past their front door. Landings that had operated for 100 years found themselves facing dry bottomland instead of moving water. Wharves built for steamboats sat useless as the current shifted a mile or more away. The very engineering project designed to save river towns from the water's fury ended up, for many of them, finishing what the floods and the railroads had started. The Missouri River towns that survived were, in the end, the ones lucky enough to be built somewhere the new channel happened to still touch, not the ones that had built their entire economy around a river that no longer wanted them. And so today, if you trace the Missouri River across the state of Missouri, you are tracing a landscape littered with towns caught at every stage of this slow disappearance. Some, like Old Franklin, were erased so completely that only a highway marker and a few local historians remember exactly where they stood. Some, like Arrow Rock, were frozen in time, preserved almost by accident because nothing ever came along to replace what the decline left behind, turning failure into an eerie kind of time capsule that historians and travelers can walk through today. Some, like Rocheport and Napoleon, simply shrank, holding on as small, quiet communities that carry the ghosts of a much louder past in their old street names and their weathered cemeteries. And some vanished so thoroughly that they exist now only in county archives, in the pages of 19th-century gazetteers, in the handwritten notes of local historical societies trying to keep a single fading memory alive before it disappears for good. What makes this story different from most tales of American decline is the sheer speed of it. These were not towns that faded gently over 100 years of gradual change. Many of them rose from nothing to boomtown status in a single decade, and then fell from boomtown to backwater in the next one, driven by forces almost none of their residents could have predicted or controlled. A flood that arrived 2 years apart, in 1826 and 1828, was enough to erase a town that had briefly rivaled any settlement west of the Mississippi. A single failed bid for a railroad line was enough to doom a river port that once employed 4 doctors and a dentist. A single overheated boiler on a single spring morning in 1852 was enough to make Lexington's stretch of river one of the deadliest places on the entire Missouri. And yet, walking through what remains of these towns today, what you find is not simply tragedy. There is something almost defiant about the pieces that survived. The hand-cut limestone gutters still lining Arrow Rock streets. The brick storefronts that never got the chance to be torn down and modernized, because there was never enough money or people left to do it. The old marker where the Santa Fe Trail once began, even if the ground beneath it has changed since it was placed. These towns did not get to choose their fate, but in refusing to grow into something else, many of them accidentally preserved a version of frontier America that almost nowhere else in the country still exists. You can stand on a bluff in Arrow Rock today and see almost exactly what a steamboat captain would have seen looking up from the water in 1860, minus, of course, the water itself, which moved on without asking permission from anyone. The Missouri River is still out there today, still shifting, still carrying silt the color of coffee with cream, still occasionally rising over its banks the way it always has and always will. It built these towns in a matter of years and unbuilt most of them just as fast, and it never once apologized for either. What's left along its banks now is a string of quiet reminders, some preserved, some crumbling, some entirely gone, that even the busiest, wealthiest, most confident towns in American history were never as permanent as the people living in them believed. The river always had the final word. It still does. If you could walk through one of these vanished river towns exactly as it looked at its peak, Old Franklin in 1820, or Arrow Rock in 1860, which one would you choose to see, and what do you think it would feel like to stand there knowing what was coming?